Welcome. We are continuing with Ulladu Narpadu Saddarshanam, verse number 6. உலகைம் புலன்களுரு வேரன்றவைம் புலனைம் பொறிக்குப் புலனாம் உலகை மனம் ஒன்றைம் பொறிவாயால் ஓர்ந்திடுதலான் மனத்தை அன்றி உலகுண்டோ அறை. The translation of this verse is that the world is nothing but the five sense objects which are brought in by the five senses, and it is the mind that cognizes the five senses. Therefore, there is no world outside of the mind. The first thing we can see is that the world is nothing but comprised of the five sense objects which we perceive every waking moment and in dream. This includes sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And the normal idea we have is that these objects are out there and our senses bring them into us, and through that we perceive the world that is objectively out there. But if we really look closely, we can see that this idea is not correct, because when I see, for example, anything, what I see is only light that hits the eyes and an image is formed. And that image is given meaning only by the memory, which is part of the mind. And this is why the perception happens not in the eye, but in the mind. And this is shown very clearly by science also, that the image in and of itself is not having any inherent meaning. The same is true of this very screen now. The light hitting from the screen is just going into the eyes like it goes into any camera. And it is just as the images of a camera are made sense only by the one who is using the camera. Similarly, the light of the eyes is made sense only by the mind, which is making sense of these images. Same is true with sound, with smell, with taste, and with touch. Therefore, we can clearly see that all the sense objects are made sense of, and through that, a world is created only in the mind. And now the question may arise that, but the eyes are not in the mind, and the eyes are out there, which is to say, the eyes are out of the mind, and the eyes bring in the images, and therefore there is some kind of an objective reality to the eyes, then, or the ears and nose and tongue and skin and so on. But even that we can see is fallacious, because the very idea of our body itself is in fact in our mind, and without memory we cannot even recognize our own body. A clear demonstration of this happens in the dream, where we have a body which has eyes, ears, nose, and all that, and there is no physical eyes, ears, nose, and all that. So the mind clearly projects the body with senses, and through those senses it apparently brings in the sense objects, which in turn creates the entire dream world. Therefore, in the dream world, we clearly see that not only are the objects out there, not out there, but is projected by the mind, but the very senses which are apparently bringing in the objects out there are also not outside the mind, but is very much inside the mind, and it is a part of the projection of the mind. And in the waking state too, if we see clearly, the Perception of our eyes and ears and nose as body organs is itself a product of the mind, which through memory recognizes these sense objects and then in turn uses them to bring the perceptions. So, this is very clear then that all the sense objects come and go, and the sense perceptions come and go, and the mind, which is the root of sense objects and sense perceptions, itself comes and goes, as we see in dream world and in waking world. So we can clearly see that the world is non different from the mind, because it is arising with the rising of the mind and subsides with the subsiding of the mind. And we already saw that truth cannot be of the nature of coming and going, and therefore the mind, which is comes and goes, and along with which the world comes and goes, is not the truth, but is impermanent and apparent appearance. So, what is the truth that makes the world, which is non different from the mind, appear? This is the question of true self inquiry. And we can clearly see that the consciousness that is there prior to the mind rising and subsiding, and which is the substratum of all three states of our life, which is the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state. This substratum of consciousness exists through all the three states, and it in turn lights up the mind, and it is the light through which the mind functions. This is the basic essential intelligence present in the universe, which animates our own existence and therefore the existence of the world. Another doubt that someone might ask when we talk about the impermanence of the world is that when we say the world rises and subsides with the mind, one can ask, but the world does exist while I sleep. So while it rises and subsides for me, it's actually out there. But that is also a flawed uh, idea, because when the world rises and subsides in, let's say, in dream, and when we wake up, we clearly don't see that world. And even in the waking state, if we are seeing the world and we go to sleep, we can never find any proof of the existence of the world unless we come back to the waking world. So the world, the reference for the proof of the waking world is only the waking world. We cannot go to the dream and find any proof of the existence of the waking world, and vice versa. Therefore, that really doesn't hold water. And so we can clearly see that the truth of the waking world is only during the waking world, just as the truth of the dream world is only during the dream world. And yet it is cover the substratum, which is the pure consciousness that abides along all three states, is not visible to us, because we take the mind and the world projected by the mind to be an actual reality, which it is clearly not, because we can see that it has no permanence and simply comes and goes, and it's also relative to the perceiver. And that is why no two people perceive the world alike. And yet it is obscured from our perception. The pure substratum of existence is obscured from our perception, much like the sun, which is obscured by the clouds. The clouds are seen only through the light of the sun, but the very clouds which are seen through the light of the sun prevents the sun from being seen. Similarly, the very light of consciousness through which the mind appears prevents the pure consciousness from being perceived. So this this is why we are taking this apparent appearance of this world and the mind to be real. But upon inquiry, it is very clear that the substratum from which the world and the mind rises and sets is alone permanent and exists across all the states of our being, and it has no rising nor setting. And as long as we take the body to be the I, and we take, therefore, the world that is projected by the mind to be real, we are ignorant of this truth. The other objection that the mind may put up is that when I am dreaming and I wake up, the dream world vanishes, but the waking world is always there. But it can be also explained thus that the dream world goes away when one wakes up from sleep, and the waking world persists because we are still in the sleep of ignorance. And if we clearly see that the waking world is simply a product of ignorance that makes us take this world to be an objective reality, and therefore we wake up from the sleep of ignorance, then we can also clearly see that the waking world only has as much reality as a dream world, which is that it has transactional reality. We cannot ignore the waking world, just as we cannot ignore the dream world within a dream. So we have transactional reality to the waking world, and we deal with it sanely and intelligently. But it is not then clearly seen as an ultimate objective reality, but simply an appearance that comes and goes in the eternal reality of pure consciousness. Now we go to the next verse, verse 7. உலகறிவு உலகறிவும் ஒன்றாய் உதித்தொடுங்குமேனும் உலகு அறிவு தன்னால் ஒளிரும் உலகறிவு தோன்றிமறைதற்கிடனாய் தோன்றிமறையாதொளிரும் பூன்றமாம் அஃதே பொருள். This verse is taken together because it re-emphasizes the same point, that the world and the mind arise together and subside together, and yet the world is seen only through the mind, and that which is the substratum for the world and the mind is alone the eternal, complete substance, Purna. So, this simply re emphasizes and reiterates the previous verse, and also makes an assertion that the substratum, which we already alluded to, is alone the complete truth, the Purna Vastu. So the there is um, when when the when we look at the um, truth that the world and the mind, they always rise together. This is something that's very clear, that we can never have one without the other. It already came in a different verse too, but it's made more explicit here, that the world and the mind concomitantly rise and set together. We cannot have a world without the individual jiva, or we cannot have the individual, which is jiva, without the world. They both come and go together. And yet, what makes the world and the individual also possible or appear is the mind, which is nothing but the power of memory and intellect and ego. In Sanskrit, four words are used: mano, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, which is the mind, the memory, the intellect, and the ego. This is what is the cause for the world to appear, even though it appears concomitantly with the world and it sets concomitantly with the world as well. And if we really then inquire as to what is the source of this fourfold mind, then we see that the fourfold mind is itself seen through the awareness of pure consciousness. And therefore, that pure consciousness, which is the substratum of existence, is what lights up the mind, and through the mind lights up the world. So, the eye through which the objects are seen is the physical eye. The eye through which the eye is seen is the mind. And the eye through which the mind itself is seen is our pure awareness. If we can see this clearly, that I am aware of the activities of the ego, the mind, the intellect, and through that I am aware of the world, of myself, and my relationship with the world, then one can clearly see that this awareness alone persists, and this is there both in the waking state and in the dream state and in the deep sleep state too, as we already saw when we looked into the koshas, that there is an awareness that one has a sound deep sleep, which upon waking up makes one realize that there is not a state of blankness but an actual state of awareness that I had a sound sleep. So, this state of this pure awareness persists across all states, whereas everything else, including the body and the whole world, comes and goes. So, if we see this clearly, then we can see that this pure awareness is our essential being, and this is the being of God. So, in the essence, our core true self is then clearly seen as the presence of God. That's the essence of these two verses. Thank you.